You're listening to On Shifting Ground from World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. The Russian government and media censors news of the war in Ukraine, which they continue to refer to as a special military operation. But that doesn't mean the Russian people aren't feeling the effects of the war at home. Rapidly rising prices in stores, the recent collapse of the Russian ruble, mean the war increasingly comes at the expense of economic stability for average Russians, many of whom are still trying to pretend the war doesn't exist. Last week we heard from Anne Applebaum about how Vladimir Putin benefits from Russia's public apathy and how he maintains power by strangling political dissent. This week, we look at what happens when Russia can no longer isolate itself from the economic chaos its war has created, and why the Russian government should be worried about consequences. Catherine Belton reports on Russia for The Washington Post. She's the author of Putin's People, a New York Times Critics' Book of 2020. She joins me now.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, since the abortive march on Moscow and later the death of Evgeny Prigozhin, one of the questions asked a lot in this sphere is, what happens to Wagner now? How do you answer that?
Wagner is being dismantled from the inside. It's pretty clear that Wagner doesn't have a future anymore without its leader now that its commander is gone. Its troops are being sort of taken over by other units. There's some connected to the defense ministry who are rapidly moving into its place, the position that it occupied in Africa. And there are other units, there are other paramilitary groups who have been set up by other tycoons who are much more loyal to the Kremlin than Prigozhin was, and they are also anxious to kind of subsume and take over Wagner's fighting capabilities. And a lot of its armory, its weapons, actually going to a unit of the Presidential Guard called the Rosgvardia. They are big winners from this fallout.
Would it be in Russia's interest, given however you define Russia's interest, to keep this sort of hybrid force armed, uniformed, and on the ground? Because the long-time fiction that they were really a private company and on their own and not controlled by the Kremlin made them a very handy thing. They could do the state's dirty work without it reflecting directly on the president. That seems like a big thing to give away.
Yes, it was very handy, which is why it's surprising, I guess, to see some of the Russian Defense Ministry units angling so hurriedly to take over in Africa. But I guess it's lucrative business because not only was Prigozhin controlling politically and militarily quite some chunks of Africa, in doing so, he was also given quite extensive mining rights to gold mines and other commodities in return. So it's big money and a lot of people want it. But one of the reasons, as you pointed out, that Wagner Group was set up in the first place was to give the Kremlin plausible deniability. We've seen a report that was commissioned by the Russian parliament in 2016 on why such paramilitary groups should be legalized. And they basically described how paramilitary groups like Wagner can act as arms of the state, as shadow arms of the state, where officially the Russian government can't be seen as acting, or where it's officially banned, or whether it's going to reflect badly. But it may be the case that with the war in Ukraine, Russia has already gone so far beyond the pale that they don't care about whether there's plausible deniability anymore or not.
It seems to be just one part of what I would call the genius of the way Russia's played a bad hand since the invasion. To work hard, to look outwardly as if Russia is observing the norms of international action, as a member in good standing of the world community, taking ceremonial photographs with other heads of state in fancy drawing rooms, participating in multilateral dialogue, sending the foreign minister to speak at the Security Council, meeting with Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey to discuss shipping through the Black Sea. Act like you're a normal country, even while things are not very normal at all, are they?
Yeah, but I think that's an increasingly difficult posture to maintain because, of course, in the West, those actions which Putin had always tried to portray as legitimate and the sense of plausible deniability that he always sought to stress whenever anything happened, like one of his rivals got poisoned by Novichok or something like that, that wasn't us. All of that has gone very strongly out of the window the minute he launched the invasion in Ukraine, the minute they began bombing and killing innocent Ukrainian civilians. Of course, they would try to have their argument for this, that they were provoked into it by NATO expansion, that the Ukrainians were about to attack Russian interests in East Ukraine, but they've never provided any evidence of that. And indeed, some of the Russian billionaires, when they privately complain about the war and how it's being conducted, that's one of their complaints, that Russia couldn't even stage a provocation properly before the war to legitimize it. So it looks like Russia's soft power efforts, its efforts to have legitimacy, have come to naught. And it's certainly lost that standing in the Western world, even if it tries to maintain some kind of relationship with leaders in China, Turkey, and across Africa. But even with the African nations, it's starting to wear thin, even if their propaganda does have quite far reach there, because when there was an African delegation in Ukraine, Russia was bombing it. And since Russia has walked out of the grain deal, I think Africa knows who is to blame for that. And it's the same with South Africa. Putin was meant to visit for the BRICS summit, but of course he didn't go. And Cyril Ramaphosa actually asked him not to go because he didn't want to be put in a very sticky situation of having this International Criminal Court warrant out for Putin's arrest. South Africa has signed up to that treaty. He wouldn't have known how to act. Of course, he didn't want to be stuck trying or refusing to arrest Vladimir Putin if he'd landed on South Africa's soil. Of course, Russia has spent a lot of time and effort cultivating the ANC since Soviet times. But again, there are limits.
In arguments about who countries' friends are in the world, there's a kind of both sidesism that seeps in. And if you're sitting in Bamako or Niamey or Nouakchott, any of the North and Western African capitals, and somebody's saying to you, well, you're going to be friends with Washington or Moscow, they perhaps have a very different point of view about where the future lies. What's the difference between Wagner and contracting companies like Blackwater or their South African equivalents that have played such a prominent role both in Africa and in the Near East?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. It's a good question because before all this happened, before the mutiny even, and I'd been speaking to someone who was around when the Wagner Group was getting established, and he was saying that it was very much inspired by Blackwater, by Eric Prince's example. They were like, look what America can do with all these paramilitary groups, and it gives them this air of deniability. And they said there's a real kind of great example for us to follow, and we have to create our own such paramilitary group, which is outside the state or ostensibly outside the state, or that's how they viewed Blackwater for sure.
Moving strictly to the Russian context, once you've killed Prigozhin, do you have to also set out very purposely to kill his ghost too? As you saw during the abortive march to Moscow, he was something of a folk hero, not seen as a traitor, but rather as an uber patriot.
Yeah, I think his killing, however, was so demonstrative. His death and sort of his plane exploding and then falling from the sky was so demonstrative. It was meant in that way, and it was meant as a clear signal to anyone who might consider following in his footsteps that this is going to be your fate too. So I think for now, Putin has very successfully put a lid on these murmurings of dissatisfaction, which Prigozhin had so effectively voiced and so vocally voiced as well. But that doesn't mean to say that there are problems in the Russian military, that the division of the opinion over the conduct of the war, which really runs deep throughout the Russian elite, has gone anywhere. Those divisions about how the war should be conducted still exist. There's a faction of so-called doves who just want the war to be ended as quickly as possible. And there are those in the more kind of hardline radical camp who think it should be prosecuted even more radically, that the bombing and so on should be more indiscriminate, and that Russia should really go all out. And Putin has been treading a path between both camps, which has been getting ever narrower. And despite Prigozhin's death, those differences haven't gone anywhere. And I guess despite the demonstrative way in which he died, perhaps we should still worry that down the road, sometime in the future, because you still have these paramilitary groups, some of them are outside the sphere of the defense ministry, some of them are run by oligarchs, by tycoons who at the moment are more loyal to President Putin, that somewhere down the road, if these differences of opinion continue, if in fact the dissatisfaction continues to grow, someone somewhere might try such a stunt again.
In your reporting, you quote a Russian billionaire who spoke on the condition of anonymity, who said everyone should now understand what the risks are. They are gigantic.
Yeah.
So now, instead of merely losing business, losing bank accounts, losing yachts, are they seriously thinking now about the prospect of losing their lives?
Yes, and I think so. And I think that fear was always there. But sort of doubts about Putin's rule as a strongman leader really grew, especially after Prigozhin's mutiny, when he was able, apparently, to get away with marching on Moscow, for Putin to have dropped the criminal charges against him, for him to be allowed safe passage to Belarus. It was really a severe blow to Putin's image as a strongman leader, and it left many thinking, well, perhaps he's not the kind of untouchable figure and this great strongman that we've all perceived him to be. Maybe if the war goes badly and Russia loses, then we could launch something like that too. And with that downing of the plane, however it happened, most in the Russian elite believe that this must have been on Putin's orders, that it must be on the Tsar's orders. So for now, they're certainly not willing to speak out against the war. Never mind try and organize some type of overthrow of Putin's power. But I don't think that's forever, because Putin's legitimacy right now is tied very, very fast to Russia's success in the war. And if there's some kind of miracle and the Ukrainians can win back territory the way they did last autumn when they took Kherson, when they took Kharkov, then Putin's standing will be again diminished.
If since the late 1990s, as Putin was becoming a person of larger and larger influence and importance, you were part of that class of men, and they are mostly men, who became among the wealthiest people on the planet, can you just lie low now, stick to your knitting and not say anything positive or negative about the war? Or must you bend the knee? Must you join in on the cheerleading? Are we watching in real time these oligarchs trying to pick a way to be during this national emergency?
I think most of them are just trying to keep their heads down, to try and bide their time, to survive while the war keeps going. Many of them are precisely doing that. They're trying not to say anything. They're trying to make sure that they keep their businesses intact, to make sure that they survive physically and that their wealth remains intact too. But that doesn't mean to say they don't privately grumble, that they're not privately horrified by what's going on. And they will wait, and they will wait for a moment. And if it's the case, because the president is there as the guarantor of stability and his legitimacy rides on that. And if there is a major military loss in Ukraine, then Putin will become vulnerable again. But till that moment, for sure, they're just going to keep their heads down. And of course, there are some who kind of pay fealty to the Tsar, and they might make statements in support of the war in order to boost their positions. But at the moment, actually, those type of boosters are few and far between. Most of them are just silent.
Is it harder to keep your head down and keep your name out of the papers when Western sanctions are putting tremendous pressure on your holdings outside of the Russian Federation?
Yes, for sure. I mean, we saw one very good example of that. There was a Russian fertilizer tycoon, Andrei Melnichenko, who gave an interview to the Financial Times in which it was really a prime example of how these guys are trying to straddle both chairs. He would not condemn the war, but he said that the sanctions were poorly executed, that they shouldn't be targeting Russian oligarchs because we can't do anything. It's not like we can persuade Putin not to prosecute this war. He wouldn't say that Russia was to blame for launching the invasion. He was sort of humming and hawing, saying, well, it depends which way you look at it. But really, he's someone who is under pressure from the sanctions. He can't enjoy his wealth in the way that he could previously. He can't swan around places in Europe on his yacht anymore. He's confined to Dubai and Istanbul, which I guess for some people might not seem like too much of a hardship, but they feel it. There's just one more Russian businessman who's spoken out very strongly against what he's called Russia's crazy war, but he is someone who already doesn't own any business in Russia. He had a banking business, but he only had a minority stake, and as the other oligarchs like to point out, he's suffering from a very severe terminal illness, and that's why they think he's been brave enough to stick his neck on the line.
I can imagine there are guys trying to thread the needle in this account, look out of Russia to the EU and say, look, I'm not one of those guys who's supporting the war, who's a member of the inner circle. And it might not be enough for the countries that are imposing sanction, but it may be too much for the Kremlin and leave you sort of between two stools. Pretty dangerous.
Yeah. This is what happened to the fertilizer tycoon Andrei Melnichenko, who gave that interview to the FT, because he was asked directly, has Putin committed war crimes in Ukraine? And first he said, well, yes, maybe in some circumstances. And then he tried to walk it back and say, well, I don't know all the circumstances, and therefore I can't comment on what precisely really happened. And it turns out that after he gave that interview, he has faced some pressure from the Russian state. There's been an investigation launched into some of his business dealings. So, yeah, it's very, very difficult to try and tread this fine line. And I think as a result, most of the Russian businessmen, the billionaires, they just try to keep their mouths shut because they realize there's no way they can win. And there are a couple of other billionaires like Mikhail Friedman, Piotr Arvin, who were among the original oligarchs. They were the founders of Alpha Group. They built very strong ties here in the West. They have a lot of friends in the US particularly, and they were recently sanctioned, even though they have this kind of friendship network, these allies in the West, because they haven't really been able to navigate this scenario. They've kept their business in Russia, which is worth billions of dollars. They haven't spoken out strongly against the war. They've made very guarded comments about it being a tragedy, but they've said no more than that. And it was clear from some research conducted by a Russian investigative media outlet, one of the few independent ones left, that in fact the businesses in which they still have stakes and where the US Treasury said they're actually still on the board of Alpha Bank, that this has been lending even during the war, extending loans to kind of Russian defense industry outfits who are arming soldiers in the war in Ukraine. So really, it's impossible. If you still have businesses in Russia, it means you can be strong-armed by the Russian state into assisting the war effort.
Let's talk a little bit about the ruble, because for a long time after the war began, after an initial plunge, the ruble recovered in part because the Russian oil and gas industries demanded payment for their exports in rubles, which helped support the currency. Then they spent a lot of foreign exchange propping it up. But now even we are starting to see the limits of that, and the ruble's floating around a penny. And apart from the loss of face that's involved in not having a currency that's stable and respected, what is the effect on the average Russian that there's on some days 100 rubles to the US dollar?
Yeah, it's really bringing the impact of the war home to many Russians, really for the first time. Those that haven't been hit by mobilizations, people in the capital who've tried to stick their head in the sand and not pay attention to political issues as they see them, they're actually feeling it on their pockets right now, because when you have the ruble devalue and when Russia, because it's able to avoid some of the sanctions and it's getting these consumer goods in still through hubs like Turkey, like Central Asia, and like China, they're having to pay more for these imports. And Russia's consumer basket, the average consumer basket, is still 40% imports. And when you have this weaker ruble, the hidden costs of sanction evasion also become more apparent, because there are lots of markups when you have to kind of send goods through an elaborate chain, often run by semi-criminal structures. It just means that everything is much, much more expensive. And you can see that directly. The Russia's largest market research agency, Ramir, recently conducted a survey, and they found that 19% of Russians are already making savings on the most basic goods like toothpaste and washing powder and food.
This also would expose over time, I guess, because to a certain degree, as I understand it, Russia's macro statistics are propped up by the tremendous amount of military spending. But if you're just a rank-and-file mujik going off to buy your food or a pair of pants or something, this becomes real for you.
Yeah, and you can tell that Putin is worried about it, and the government. There was an official from the central bank who warned again that they might have to rise interest rates after increasing them by 3.5% just a few weeks ago. He said we might have to do it again. Inflation is still a problem. I think it's because the ruble devalued by 20% over the last couple of months, and it means that the inflationary impact of that is yet to hit. It's going to happen over the next 3 to 6 months as prices go up. And you've seen Putin openly worry and call on his officials to keep inflation in rein. I mean, it might not be much of an election, but he is meant to face presidential elections in March, and that's probably exactly when the inflationary spike is going to be coming. So it's quite sticky for them. But I don't think this means that they're going to start reining in the spending on the military industry. I mean, this is one of the other causes of inflation, because Russia this year is on target to spend more than $100 billion on the defense industry as it tries to ship arms to the front. And this is really kind of causing wage inflation, causing labor shortages, because defense entities are working around the clock and they're running out of workers. Things could get much trickier for them if the West were to tighten what's been its most effective sanction on the Russian economy, and that's the oil embargo and the oil price cap. So in December last year, the EU imposed an embargo on Russian oil shipments to the EU, and the G7 fixed an oil price cap on all exports elsewhere outside of Europe, saying that Russia's oil couldn't be sold for any higher than $60 a barrel. That's the thing that's had a real impact on Russia's balance of payments, which has been putting all the pressure on the ruble. Russia's main source of revenue from energy is down 47% already in the first half of the year. And this is the thing that's really putting the pressure on the ruble. And economists say, were the West to take collective action to make that oil price cap even lower, say at $30, then the Russian treasury would be in real trouble.
Well, would other third-party countries, ones that maybe aren't that opposed to Russia, simply take advantage of the new cap, as we've seen India and China do with the old one of $60? Or would they say, no, we know you can't pump it, you can't ship it for that price, we'll pay you with the old price? I mean, what exactly are the fence sitters going to do if that cap is lowered?
Well, that happens already. I mean, of course, it's in India, China's interest to pay less for Russian oil, but it's also pushing a lot of the oil trade into the shadows, because what happens is officially, yes, most of them are paying the oil price cap, paying the price set at the cap, but they will pay in kickbacks and markups extra to these offshore tankers and trading companies which are selling the oil. So all the profits go into this kind of shadowy network that we can't see, but the Russian budget itself is deprived. And the Russian budget is the one that's pouring the money into the defense industry.
If you're trying to understand what's really going on inside Russia economically, what should you be watching in the next several months? What will you be looking for?
I'll be watching very closely the ruble rate. I'm still looking at it every day. And since the mini crisis of a few weeks ago when, yes, the ruble did go over 100 to the dollar, which was really kind of a big blow to Putin, especially to face a crisis like that after only just surviving a political mutiny. They tried to rein it in through this big rate hike, and it did stabilize briefly, but now the ruble is nudging towards 100 again. So it kind of looks like something that they can't control. I will be watching to see if the West is ever going to be ready to put the price cap at an even lower level, because this would really put Russia's budget under strain. It would mean the finance ministry or the central bank would have to start printing money to sustain Russia's defense industry, and that's when inflation could really get out of control. But it seems that we're far away from that at the moment, and the West isn't ready to take such a risky move to lower the price cap because they fear that Russia will just cut off production and send global prices rising everywhere.
Catherine Belton is the author of Putin's People. She covers Russia for the Washington Post. Great to have you with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. The program was produced by Elise Manukian and Andrew Stelzer. Our researcher is Adam Ailey. The program was fact-checked by Sienna Barnes. This episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.